Well, thank you very much, Your Holiness, for attendance this morning again. We appreciate any of your advice for the conversations. And thank you very much for your audience, ladies and gentlemen, for coming back again for this morning. Yesterday, we had a global view of the structure of the science conceptually, how to relate with the structure frameworks of the religion. And this morning, we gradually transfer onto more concrete aspect of the mind, how mind works and how it's structured. And probably the first dialogue will be brought up into by Shinobu Kitayama, who is a professor of psychology at the University of Michigan. And also he is a part of the Kokoro Research Center, as I am. And are you okay to start your talk? And actually he is the founder of the cultural neuroscience. And cultural neuroscience is, better than myself explaining the introduction but asking him directly. So please, Shinobu.
Oh, thank you very much. It's my great honor and privilege to be part of this fascinating symposium. I enjoyed so much, and I also feel so honored to be sitting here right next to you, Your Holiness. And I'm very grateful to you as well as Mind and Life Institute and Kokoro Center of Psychology at Kyoto University. Yesterday, I enjoyed so much about almost everything, but among others, I was struck by one very interesting theme, which was emphasized your remark, Your Holiness, and the same theme that came up in some of the talks, which is that everything in the world is closely interdependent with each other. So, for example, yesterday Professor Mori argued that even mathematical objects, the presence of it, meaning of it, definition of it, is dependent on category, which is mathematicians' way of calling environment, which is no different from context. And today, in my presentation, I'd like to push this line of argument one more step and apply it to a human being, and argue that very analysis of human mind may require very close attention to context, both temporal and also geographical, and to make the point that cultural context can be very significant in understanding the human mind. The field I'm... So I'm working in this field called cultural neuroscience. So I'd like to give just a few words about what this field is. And bottom line of this is that the humanity is one. There's only one humanity, which is unified. And yet, manifestation of humanities can be diverse. So mentalities can be multiple. And one very useful way to analyze this variability is to look at cultural models of the self or the person. And I apply this idea and combine it with the notion of neuroplasticity, and to argue that the brain might be molded in some systematic way through engagement in the cultural world. And finally, I'd like to make some presentation on possible connection or relationship between culture and evolution. So let me start with the idea of cultural neuroscience. As a psychologist, and many psychologists in the audience are interested, and I suppose Buddhists as well, just very essence of Buddhism as well is to focus on human mind, different faculties, and so on. We also study self, cognition, emotion, motivation, and in the last 2 decades, substantial progress has been made to map out between those psychological functions and the brain processes. So, for example, some particular part of the brain appears to be particularly involved in the processing of self-relevant information. And in fact, this kind of analysis has resulted in several very, very interesting fields within psychology, such as cognitive neuroscience, affective neuroscience, and social neuroscience. In the last 10 years ago, a very brief period of time, however, it has become increasingly clear that the brain is not a static entity. Richie Davidson yesterday made a fascinating presentation to make that point. So brain itself can change as a function of experience. And of course, experience can come from somewhere, and the environment is different, then different experience can arise. And some aspects of environment is ecological, some other aspects are more social, still some other aspects are cultural. So we try to see if those different aspects of environment might have systematic influences on the human brain through the mechanism of neuroplasticity. At the same time, brain is a biological organ. Brain is a biological organ, and as such, basic design of the brain is encoded in genes. However, at the same time, genes are not static entity either. So Richie yesterday made again another fascinating point that the expression of gene, epigenetics, can be influenced by environmental experience. But at the same time, I like to add one more point, namely that variants of each particular gene, called polymorphisms, can change rather rapidly as a function of experience that takes place in different kinds of environment. So situation is very, very, very complicated, and cultural neuroscience is a name some of us use to designate this more holistic way of approaching the human mind. In investigating human variability in psychological functions, we found it particularly useful to look into some very simplified models of the person, which are more or less salient in different cultural, historical, ethnic, and religious contexts. So independent view of the self is very salient in Western context. The self is considered to be independent, defined by internal attributes, and social relations themselves are imagined to be based on this model. So for example, you can choose your friends, and the relationship can arise, and yet this relationship is based on independent model. Out of this, there's a disjoint agency. Agency is disjoint. In many other parts of the world, more interdependent. Many other parts of the world, including Asian traditions particularly, more relational attributes of the self are considered much more important. So relationship with their parents, child, or important significant others are considered to be much more important. And self-defining aspects involve those relational features such as social roles, obligations, duties, and so on. As a consequence, agency does exist, but agency tends to be much more inclusive and encompassing. We call it more conjoint. In order to investigate, well, one more important point I like to add is the following. In investigating the effects of cultural models on the brain, we found it important to emphasize the notion of cultural tasks. Depending on underlying model of the self, there are many normative tasks, kind of things that people have to do to be a decent individual. So, for example, given the independent model of the person, it may be important to be unique, to express the self, to realize your own potential, or to promote your own goals and be direct. Those are some of the most important cultural tasks in independent cultures. Now, if you go to more interdependent cultural context, there are equally many and a variety of cultural tasks, but nature of cultural tasks can be very different. So, for example, belonging, fitting in, occupying one's place, in doing right thing, promoting others' goals, and be rather indirect, just more receptive to what people might say. Those tasks might be more salient and more significant. And the point is, if you are engaging in those different sets of cultural tasks from day one through, say, my age, 55, and your brain may not be free from cultural context. And in fact, your brain can be significantly influenced by culture. So just to illustrate this, well, this is a basic idea I'm advocating. Cultural tasks, culture can influence brain through repeated active engagement in those tasks. Just to explore this idea, here's one experiment where subjects are asked to perform very simple cognitive tasks. Subjects find very simple sequence of alphabets like this, and there are several different sequences like this, and all they have to do is to look at the center letter and to indicate whether the center letter is S or H in this case. This is a pretty easy task, but subjects really have to perform this very fast. As a result, they occasionally make errors.
There's anti computer test chair, that made doing it, and you can run all of that. You get the car to S to H to get it, and I'm going to two button lamsa, compassion, chichi warsa, and the quarter.
So subjects perform this task on the computer screen, and when subjects make an error.
So every time you show 5 letters at a time.
Yes.
A sequence.
Right.
Okay.
That's
quite
right.
Fast, but they come in units of 5.
Right, that's right.
Okay.
That's correct. That's correct.
And then?
Okay. So when subjects perform this task, they sometimes make errors, mistake. When subjects make a mistake, they would say, oops, in English. But brain has its own language. That language is called error-related negativity. So error is being made here, 0. And nearly simultaneously with the error itself, there's a negative deflection of brain wave. This negative deflection is called error-related negativity. And just to indicate that the brain is registering the fact that it's going to make an error. And one very interesting property of this error-related negativity is that the magnitude of this effect increases when the task is very important. Very important. So our experiment made use of this to investigate whether the self is really important for you, your holiness, or your friend might be more important for your holiness. To do this, we set it up such that subjects could earn many points as a function of performance in this task. Sometimes subjects knew that the points they earn would be exchanged with a gift that they can keep themselves. So that's self-condition. However, in some other cases, subjects knew that they earn points and the points could be exchanged to a gift to be given to the best friend on campus. Later, of course, we ask, did you work just as hard for your friend? And everybody says, yes, of course. Of course, I'm a nice man. I did work very hard for my friends, just at least as hard as I did for myself. Question is whether the brain might be telling you the same thing. So here's the result, European American results. Those are European American undergraduates.
Shinobu, can I? 이거 강강한데 기대 에스타 에스레도 진짜
마신도
노르투갈이야 간다 등엘 노르투갈 노봉은 제치도 보고 있어 봐. 노르베갈이야 레벤 남주람서 정거스를 만오고네. 근데 뒤 간사 코랑 노 맞춰베네 레벤 남주단디야 파리에다 파르고 있어 봐. 포르투갈이야 다티
노블 시베 시범군도 못 주고는 레벨 구조되고
레벨 구조되고 있어 봐. 다디 간사 코랑 개지 좀 되제 데 숙치 좀 개발도 그랬어. 디인사데 구조 쳐봐 제일이야. 아니 레가도 제일 주 다텔이야. 아니 간다 마노바 야부체도 되는 그냥 멤버라 그랬어. 멤버 수준이야 그랬어. 직접 야 멤버 디스크란스 로봇을 때 그랬어. 대대지도 간데 따져.
Makes sense. So here's a result from the friend condition for European American undergraduates at the University of Michigan. There's clear ERN.
근데 가서 시베 노바 마시고나 레베 시기연을 봐. 또 레베 상에 제토를.
So since this kind of error-related
negativity
is popping up before the conscious awareness of making the error, does that mean, one could extend that line of thinking and say, even when it comes to distinguishing between right and wrong, can you say the same thing? That the distinction
can judge by brain without mind.
The conscious.
Well, there's a quite intense debate right now if this is really unconscious or at the fringe of consciousness subjects knew that they are making the error. So remember last time when you are closing the door and suddenly you remember that the door is auto-lock and lock and you don't have the key. And you know that you are making a mistake even though you cannot stop the response itself. That's true for me. I'm not sure if that's true for your Holiness. However, that seemed to characterize this effect pretty well. That is, subjects kind of know that they are screwing things up. However, they cannot do anything about it. That's an interesting effect.
일루티기 켜가지고 누가 받아 일루변에 그래서 모두 못 죽고 원비시바를 하니까 즉 일단 나와버티 근데 켜가지고 하는 그래나
Holiness is wondering, in Buddhist epistemology we make distinctions between the perceptual processes and the thought that comes after. So maybe at the level of thought, maybe the conscious awareness may not have come. But
I think people believe that this is more or less perceptual matching between your expectation of a correct response and brain's automatic computation of their own response. If there's a mismatch, there's this negativity. And that might be conscious, but consciousness is very shallow. And afterward, subjects may recognize that they made an error, and this deep dip called positivity is sometimes considered as a sign of consciousness.
Maybe the last speaker, Shinobu, can touch on this in more detail.
Yes.
And his subject
So for example, His Holiness was thinking that imagine two people doing this task. One person is kind of a little tired. The other one is much more alert. So would you see a difference in their response?
I think a lot of people show greater ERN.
So there is a connection to the alertness of the...
Probably. I'm not aware of any good experimental demonstration right now. However, when the task is very important, for example, you might be losing money when you are making a mistake. Under those conditions, ERN is larger. So if importance is related to alertness, surely alertness should be correlated with greater magnitude.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I think it might be very hard to compare across individuals just by single amplitude of the potential. But within subject, I'm pretty sure, and I entirely agree with Professor Kitayama, that within the single subject, when very alert versus very tired, the amplitude may very well correlate with the mental state. So comparing across people with brain activity is one thing. It's very difficult. Within the subject, it's a very reliable indicator of mental state.
What about, would age be also a factor?
Age?
Age, yeah.
I don't know.
Usually,
possible.
At young
age.
Young age, maybe you see their brain because of something very fresh. Then old person like me, perhaps I think brain already now a little bit slower.
It's very possible. So in any event, in this experiment, we compared self-condition and other condition, friend condition. This is the result from friend condition. So they are registering error here. However, when we examine the self-condition,
motivation, self-centric.
So subjects showed greater ERN when they try to earn points for themselves. So they must be more alert, even though they acknowledge that they are working just as hard for their friends. Brain is telling you something different.
European Americans.
So now this is the results from European American students.
I think that's difficult to generalize. I think many American, very altruistic-minded American also there, and very self-centered, very selfish Asian also there.
I think,
so now we also tested, that's very interesting comment, Your Holiness, because we tested European American subjects, compared these results with the results from Asian-born Asian students.
How many people are involved in this kind of...
This is based on about 20 people. That's pretty standard, by the way. And here, this is Asian results. Another group of about 20 subjects. And what's interesting is that there's no difference here.
No, rather shares that.
No difference.
That means Asians are more altruistic.
Well, you can argue that both Asians and European Americans are equally self-centric, but the self is different. Self is defined by the bounded entity for European Americans. Your body is yourself, and friend is separate from the self. But Asian self is more inclusive, more conjoined, so that...
The Nubjo Jizo Digit Zo Kanda Rang Zo Tobo Yong Dang.
Okay.
Okay. Now, we use the questionnaire.
Of course, I think it's the environment, lifestyle.
Yes, lifestyle.
I think those community, because of the lifestyle, more because of the cooperation,
community,
even the family level, work together, husband, wife, work together, or whereas is independently is carrying some job. So I think the environment, but the West and East is not too something.
His Holiness is wondering, to what extent it's really a consequence of environment, the kind of lifestyle you lead.
I think that's a consequence of environment. Consequence of environment. Different cultural groups emphasize different cultural tasks. Cultural tasks of social harmony, cooperation, those are more important in Asian cultures. And if you measure by a questionnaire how important people think about interdependence, clearly this effect is correlated with interdependence. So this self-centric effect, this difference between red wave and blue wave goes down very systematically as a function of importance given to interdependence.
I think Africans, particularly those because of the bush people, I think they are alive. I think the whole group work together. So do you think Africa belongs to Asia or West?
Well, I
between
think,
there.
I think it's not a matter of East or West, but more of a tasks, people, cultural normative things to do, social cooperation.
So you haven't done any test on Africa, though?
No, not yet. Not yet. I'm very curious to find out. I think community-oriented people is likely to show Asian pattern of the result.
So it's nothing to do with ethnicity. It's more the cultural environment. Yeah.
Cultural environment, but cultural environment change rather systematically as a function of.
I think in Asia also, I think, or Asia or Europe also, I think people in big city, people in rural area, I think something different.
Yes, that's correct. That's correct.
So lifestyle makes differences.
That's right. I agree. May I go on?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me change the gear a bit and pose a question, how can we learn our own culture? And typical opinion in the literature is that reinforcement learning is very important. So when you do something in the family, you may be praised and complimented by parents, for example, then you acquire that cultural behavior. And if that's the case, there might be some very interesting way to address individual differences. Some people get culture more than some others. And one interesting possibility is that maybe those people who are very high in reward sensitivity, that is, people who are moved so much when somebody important praise you or compliment you, then those people might acquire culture more. If that's the case, one more thing that's very interesting is that there might be some genetic differences as well, because we know that reward sensitivity is related to dopamine, neurotransmitter that goes to part of the brain that processes reward. And dopamine is regulated by some select set of genes, and then cultural acquisition may also be different as a function of such genes. And one particular gene we looked at is called DRD4, dopamine receptor gene. And this gene is very interesting. Gene is a very complicated entity. But one particular segment of this gene, there's a region that shows many different variability. One segment of the gene may be repeated only 2 times, 4 times, 7 times, 10 times, and so on. As it turned out, 7 repeat and 2 repeat and 4 repeat variants are most common. And also we know that reward sensitivity, that is dopamine signaling efficiency, is higher for people who are carrying 7 repeat or 2 repeat as compared to people who are carrying 4 repeat.
The gene chiraba dopamine. Kasi ma taram sala kamyo chumana. The dopamine chiraba de nalolia gene sequence tengyo res. The chi nyamboyoya, the du nyamboyoya, the ni nyamboyoya chebe, and the shi nyambo duyoya, the ni nyamboyoya, the riti. This kanda rishungo koyule, there's a chevaruche. They don't shoot and shoot cheva tearuche. The Quran and this were the rishung, the Jizo Quran, Kumshi, the Kadis, Jangiors Labena, and Puchin Galia, Chevaka, Pamedel Durtan, that the Yawish the reinforcement of Tony Goris.
There's one more very interesting thing about DRD4, which is this. As a result of whole genome deciphering, which was made possible in the last several years, we now know that 7 repeat is the most ancient. And then 7 repeat emerged out of it about 50,000 years ago. I found it extremely interesting because about 50,000 years ago, humans spread out of Africa to all over the globe. And then 2 repeat emerged about 10,000 years ago. Again, this number is extremely interesting because that's a time when humans began sedentary living form with agriculture. And not only this, one more...
DNA.
So how do you figure out the dating? I mean, how is the dating done?
Well, it's beyond my understanding. However, what happens is that there's an entire record of genes for...
So as a result of the Genome Project?
Yes, Genome Project. 200 Europeans, 200 Africans, 200 Asians. And if you analyze genome sequence very carefully, it's possible when some mutations happened and when those mutations that happened have been incorporated into the genome.
So it's based on kind of DNAs.
Yes, yes, that's correct.
That's done.
That's correct. Yes.
Like kind of.
Nobody went all the way back to 50,000 years ago. No, that's not the point.
So some cells or some sort of particles, so long, body alive, still there. As soon as it die, there are some of these cells may
disappear. Yeah.
So this is very interesting that it's genetic change happening just when culture is being formed.
His Holiness is still intrigued because the dating, because it's always done retrospectively. So if you think in terms of the decomposition process and so on, that's one thing. But then to make the suggestion that this particular expression of gene came around such and such time, how does the logic
it is
work
called
there?
genetic clock, and it's calculation of the possibility of the mutation, the various possibilities. And I don't know the detail of the computations, but it's called genetic clock, and it's proved to be very accurate.
Gene pasu dabion dugal mutation sa namjul sawa dugal namjul sawa ta kaju ma dundi. So it's sort of an approximate calculation.
Right, very approximate.
They do, approximately.
So here's let me skip this for the interest of time, but this is simply to show that frequency of 7 repeat and 2 repeat increase systematically as the place is farther away from Africa. Now, given this, we wanted to see if 7 repeat and 2 repeat carriers of DRD4 acquire their culture more. So that seems like initial reasonable step to investigate in this type of investigation. So we genotyped about 400 people, about half of them Europeans, about half of them Asian-born Asians at the University of Michigan campus, and subjects filled out indicators of independence and interdependence. And the result is here. So what you see is that, y-axis indicate greater independence, more positive, greater interdependence, more negative. And what you see is that European Americans tend to be more independent. They want to express their opinions more, their interests first. Asians, more interdependent, social harmony more important. Your happiness depends on happiness of other people. And this is true for carriers of 7 and 2 repeat of DRD4. Very interestingly, there was no cultural difference for the remaining people. We found this quite intriguing and took this as an initial evidence that this particular gene or some genetic change must have taken place in the last, say, 10 to 50,000 years ago so that they can form stronger cultural norms, social norms, to make larger group possible, larger group which are not kin-based. And around that time, humans began to create what we know as a culture. So here's very interesting, potentially very interesting case of gene by culture, interaction, and co-evolution. And of course, this is very preliminary evidence. However, I think this is very interesting as well in elucidating the origin of our cultural groups. So to summarize, today I talked about cultural neuroscience and distinguished between 2 models of the self and illustrated possible brain consequences of this by looking at ERN in that gift-giving game. And finally, we explored potential connection between culture and evolution by looking into DRD4. And in the end, I think bottom line is that to understand the human mind, it's really essential to understand fundamental interdependence between brain, culture, and even genes. So even what you might call independent mode of being, American individualism as the most prototype, even independence is based on close interdependence. And interdependence is the fundamental cornerstone of the human presence.
Right. Dikare, ERN sati.
No.
DRN sati.
Error related negativity.
Right. Thank you. Wonderful.
Thank you.
So
Thank you. I took up too much time. I apologize.
It was important,
Very good.
And I consumed the time in sake of better understandings.
Very good. Wonderful.
And you mentioned that the people's selves are interdependent, and the genes goes away when it's dead. So probably the next speaker, Joanne, is going to tell us about the interdependence of the self, termination of the self. We don't.
One thing that you didn't really bring up is if there is any difference in the models of self between genders. Has that been looked at?
Interestingly, well, in some ways, clearly women are more interdependent because of biological functions, probably. But when we use the measures of interdependence, which works in culture, they don't work in gender, and vice versa. So ways in which women are interdependent may be different from ways in which, say, for example, interdependent people, such as Asians, are interdependent. So specific ways, there are many different ways to be interdependent. Women are interdependent in some ways, which are different from, say, for example, Asians in this experiment are interdependent. And right now we don't know anything more than that, but very interesting.
All right, thank you very much. And may I invite the next speaker?
Thank you.
So next dialogue will be brought in by John Halifax, who is a founder and abbot of the Zen Center in the United States, and also the pioneer of the end-of-life studies. And of course, she is a part of the Life and Mind Institute, Mind and Life Institute. So please, John.
So nice to see you. Your Holiness, I've had the great privilege of sitting with dying people for the past 45 years. And it has been, I know it might appear as though Mind and Life is my full-time job, but actually this work in the end-of-life care field has been my primary focus since 1970. And in the course of that, it has been very clear that not only are dying people suffering, but also clinicians are suffering as well. And I'm speaking specifically in the Western context. I can't speak about Asia, though I have taught in India, in Malaysia, Japan. But I can speak with a great deal of experience, from the point of view of a great deal of experience in terms of the United States and Europe. And as a result of that, I've had the opportunity to teach in many institutions in the United States, very august institutions like Johns Hopkins Medical School or MD Anderson, and to bring the kind of work forward that we've been exploring for a quarter of a century here in Mind and Life, how the contemplative perspective influences our care of dying people, and how we can actually apply perspectives and practices that are contemplatively based and an ethic that's contemplatively based in care of the dying, but also in care of the caregivers. So I wanted to begin the presentation with an acknowledgement of our mutual friend, Francisco Varela, who's the scientific founder of Mind and Life. And also, Sai-san, I wanted to acknowledge your relationship with this meeting here and your friendship with Francisco. This meeting would not be happening save for your connection with Francisco. And I want to really begin my presentation, Your Holiness, with the words of a clinician who works very closely with us, who is medical director of Mission Hospice. And this was in an email that he sent to me some years ago. But it characterizes, Your Holiness, what this presentation is about, which is what is compassion in care of the dying. And he wrote me, I'm up late admitting patients to the inpatient hospice unit. Just when I think I'm too old for these late nights without sleep, a person in all their rawness, vulnerability, and pain lays before me. And as my hands explore the deep wounds in her chest, and my ears open to her words, my heart cracks open once again. And this night, a sweet 36-year-old woman with her wildly catastrophic breast cancer speaks of her acceptance and her hope for her children. And she speaks with such authenticity and authority. And her acceptance comes to me as the deepest humility a person can experience. And then, again, once again, I remember why I stay up these late nights and put myself in the company of the dying. So Dr. Pasternak has been a long-time associate and faculty member with our work, bringing our work into the world. And I think that he characterizes in his relationship with his patient precisely the qualities that I want to explore with you here from a more pragmatic perspective. But the outcome of the pragmatism is this expression of compassion that is truly boundless. So this presentation explores what compassion is, what are the challenges to compassion, compassion training, how it's conventionally done and how we do it, a map of compassion and intervention, and compassion's future. And my contention has been, Your Holiness, that one can't teach compassion. That in fact, compassion is an emergent process that's primed by non-compassion elements that are trainable. And so what this presentation explores is a systems-based heuristic map of compassion that is nonlinear, context-sensitive, and composed of the following elements: attention and pro-social affect, ethical intention and insight, and very importantly, embodiment and engagement. So this work, Your Holiness, comes out of 45 years in this field, but also many decades of training clinicians and caregivers where I've basically felt like the student. I've learned so much from the people who do the work in the field. And I also want to credit Mind and Life, because I can honestly say my access to these august institutions, to these very renowned institutions, would not be possible without the neuroscience and the social psychology which is underlying the work that I'm presenting. And in fact, you'll see a very essentialized exposition of the work, but when I have more time going into the social psychology and neuroscience, because of what Mind and Life has done, the work that Richie and Antoine Letts, Tanya Singer, of course, Francisco has made a huge impact in the medical field, which of course respects evidence. I'm not going to get this work into the medical field based on religion or spirituality. It will really be in the vehicle of science. And then Eastern perspectives on compassion, which has been an area I've been involved with for many decades. So in the most simple way, compassion is considered to be the capacity to actually attend to the experience of others. Attention is really critical. And then to feel concern for others. And then to sense into what will serve others, and then potentially to be of service. So that's a very essentialized definition, but as you will see, it characterizes the elements of the map that I'll be sharing with you shortly. Now, there are very serious challenges to compassion in healthcare settings. And our goal, of course, in working with people who have catastrophic illness is to alleviate the suffering or the total pain of those who are ill, to also be with the suffering of family members and friends, because as Dr. Kitayama was so clear about, dying is happening in a social context. And also to realize that social context includes as well the caregivers that are professional. But what we see in the United States is that there are high rates of stress among caregivers, including this stat, which is up to 60% of practicing physicians report symptoms of burnout, emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and a low sense of accomplishment. And this burnout is actually related to the poor quality of care of patients. So this has to do with patient dissatisfaction, an increase of medical errors, lawsuits, and a decreased ability to actually be compassionate. And Your Holiness, burnout happens very early in medical education. Nearly half of third-year medical students report burnout. And there's a strong association between medical student burnout and suicidal ideation. And what is even more disturbing is to actually look at the statistics related to suicide among clinicians. For male clinicians, the male clinician is 1.41 times more likely to commit suicide, and the female clinician 2.27 more likely to commit suicide. So these stress areas have been broken down by me into various components because it's, from my point of view, really important to identify the issues that clinicians face before we even introduce the notion of compassion. It's the recognition of their suffering that is essential and the qualities of their suffering. And I identified 6 main states that I think are really critical for us to further study. One is pathological altruism, which is when altruism actually harms oneself physically or mentally. Vital exhaustion or burnout, which is cumulative work demands and stress. Vicarious trauma, which is dysfunction that arises from prolonged exposure to suffering, very similar in symptoms to PTSD. Moral distress, which is an area that I've focused on and recently with colleagues have published important, I feel, journal papers. And this is anger that's provoked by a real or perceived violation of an ethical standard. Excuse me. Horizontal and vertical hostility, and this is when there's basic bullying behaviors that are vertical in nature, for example, doctors bullying nurses, or horizontal hostility, and this is when, for example, nurses treat each other disrespectfully. And what we know is that 15 to 20% of nurses in the United States leave the nursing profession because of bullying each other, not just the vertical. And finally, structural violence, which is a term characterized or created by Johan Galtung, which is about systemic discrimination. And that is when people who have particular sexual preferences or races or a lower SES do not have access to services that they deserve or are treated in ways that are not only disrespectful but harmful. So it's very critical that there be compassion training in healthcare. Healthcare in America is often referred to as a system that's very broken in spite of our high technological expertise. And what we've done is to discover that compassion is not valued, in fact, in the Western healthcare system. It's not well understood. And it is also often termed in terms of when people are compassionate and not regulated, compassion fatigue. So compassion fatigued is looked on as something that is threatening or ominous. But in fact, people do not understand the difference between empathy and compassion. And what we know from the work of Richie and Tanya Singer, Chuck Raison and others, is that compassion actually enhances a number of features, creates greater robustness in those who experience it. For example, I reviewed the slide yesterday with Richie to be sure I wasn't off target, but the brain-heart resonance, the enhancement of prosocial emotions and social connectivity, gamma, states of awakening in the brain, enhances the reduction of inflammatory and negative mood response to stress, even in novices, and it probably enhances lifespan by being a buffer against stress. But all of this sounds very good, but we have to see it in the context of understanding what compassion is. Now, another thing is that compassion, when it is trained in a medical setting, is trained behaviorally. In other words, the outer behaviors associated with compassion are what are trained. So this is a cartoon. It's a joke, and it says, "Of course I'm listening to your expression of spiritual suffering. Don't you see me making eye contact, striking an open posture, leaning towards you, and nodding empathically?" So that's, in general, the signs of compassion, or the behaviors of compassion, that are outer, that are trained in clinicians, but have nothing to do with the inner state of the clinician. And we have... So our approach to compassion is the opposite, if you will. What we're trying to do is to actually address the inner mental processes that prime compassion. And the first thing is to understand that there's a distinction between empathy and compassion. Indeed, empathy is a step that leads toward compassion, but it's a feeling into, it's a vicarious sharing of the same feeling with another. Whereas compassion, put most simply, is a feeling for another. And that feeling is not necessarily isomorphic or the same as the affective state of the one who's suffering. And one of the pieces of work, again, through Mind and Life that's been very important in the development of our training process is the work of Nancy Eisenberg, Your Holiness. And we've taken her model and done a revision of that model, just very briefly, where she talks about 3 streams of empathy, perspective taking, and memory, the affective, cognitive, and the personal experience, which combine together when witnessing suffering. These 3 streams from Eisenberg, and it's also her work is deeply influenced by Daniel Batson. These 3 streams combine when perceiving suffering to give rise to an arousal level that is essential to experience, because many times compassion is looked on as you shouldn't actually feel that much. But if the arousal level is not regulated, then what arises is personal distress, and 2 possibilities. One is called selfish prosocial behavior, and the other response is is fear-related, fear-based behaviors, which are moral outrage, the avoidance behaviors of actually avoiding or abandoning the patient, or freeze or numbing. When the arousal level is regulated, then concern for others arises and compassion then is primed. So that's Eisenberg's model.
단 메시브 계속 되게 되는 상담자 그 동안 상담자 대래야네 동안 텐데서 로시게는 되게 슈골은 이제 초 누구래서 다들 아이젠버그 계시에부터 뭐 배셔 재미있어.
So, Your Holiness, another important feature which was brought to my attention by Tanya Singer during our small meeting on compassion in Michigan some years ago. And this is when Tanya made the point in her research with people suffering from alexithymia, which is an autism-related disorder, that the same neural networks were involved in the capacity for interoceptivity, that is, reading one's visceral processes, as in being able to sense into the experience of another, or empathy. And people who suffer from alexithymia are both very low in their capacity to be interoceptive and also to be empathic. And when it was like an aha that went off for me, because what I realized was how often disembodied clinicians are, how distant they are from their own somatic experience. And I made up a very sort of simple equation at that time that interoception primes empathy, combined with positive regard and insight, giving rise to compassion. That was the first simple equation that really came out of that meeting. I was so grateful to Tanya. I then had the opportunity to basically work on this equation, and I asked myself the... I asked myself three very simple questions. I said, can there be compassion without attentional and affective balance, without altruistic intention and insight, and without embodiment and indirect or direct engagement? Very simple questions. Of course, the conclusion was no. All these processes, I recalled, from the point of view of my own contemplative experiences, are trainable. And then what came out of this were three interdependent training axes, because what I also recognized is that all of these processes, Your Holiness, are interdependent. They're also inactive. They're happening in a social context. They're happening in a physical environment. So I actually called the first version of this model an heuristic inactive model. But the training axes include the attentional and affective domains, the cognitive domains of intention and insight, and the somatic domain of embodiment and engagement. And of course, this is a heuristic process. So this is how we train clinicians to actually recognize these domains and to train in these very specific domains. So the attentional domain training has to do with the cultivation of attentional stability. And this is in order to actually recognize suffering. And also to be able to turn one's attention to one's interoceptive processes. We've also learned from recent work of Adamson and Rebecca Todd that affect biases attention and attention biases affect. So it's very important to help the clinicians learn to involve themselves in a reappraisal process where they actually engage in the development of pro-sociality instead of the anti-sociality, the skepticism and cynicism that you often see in clinicians. So the cultivation intentionally of positive regard for others. So in addition to the kindness aspect, the positive, the pro-social regard, to actually train people how to be in affective resonance, to engage the experience of empathy. Also, from the point of view of the cognitive domain, it has been essential to, if you will, reinitialize the issue of intention. That is, that there's an ethical perspective that primes the care of others, and that this work is about the development of a deep moral ground with a moral imperative, the cultivation of moral sensitivity in order to prime a moral character. So this is a very important element excuse me, in the training process, and we have a tremendous amount of content on this. In relation to insight, another cognitive domain, we train people in the role of metacognition, self-awareness, the value of the value of perspective taking, and very importantly, Your Holiness, again, from the work of Mind and Life, has been the value of being able to distinguish self from other. So if there's an over-identification with the other, the arousal level goes into absence of regulation. In addition, an insight, excuse me, an insight into the truth of impermanence, of interconnectedness, the value of happiness, and another issue in the cognitive domain, which is very difficult for clinicians to understand, but this is opening up to the importance of not being attached to outcome. So where compassion has these two valences, one is doing the absolute best for your patient, based in a number of mental processes, but at the same time, not being attached to outcome, because what we've learned from the point of view of our clinical experiences is that it produces within clinicians a deep sense of futility when they're pushing for an outcome, which usually doesn't happen. Finally, the somatic domain, Your Holiness, which is the embodied domain, which is training clinicians in being really grounded so equanimity can be present and viscerally attuned, priming empathy, and then engaged. So it looks like this, Your Holiness. This Venn diagram, where all of the features are interacting with each other and overlapping, and they prime compassion. And this is one of the important aspects of this model, that it is not a linear model, it's an interactive and dynamic model. Then it became an imperative to develop a very simple intervention for clinicians to actually engage in vivo, so while they're in the process of interaction, acting with patients. And so I developed this called the GRACE process of compassion-based interactions, and this is now being used by literally hundreds of clinicians. It's like something in your back pocket, but I think you and Jimp and others in this audience will recognize the depth of this very simple process that requires quite a bit of training to actualize, but clinicians have found this extremely useful. The first is you're with a patient. You're with a patient, so you gather your attention, you recall your intention. You attune first to yourself in order to see your biases, which one can do by attuning somatically, affectively, and cognitively, then attuning to others. This is the opposite of what most clinicians do. They attune to the other and not recognize their biases. They engage then in an internal process of considering what will really serve. Then they engage. And what is also really important is to actually conclude the interaction, either through direct acknowledgement or an internal acknowledgement. So in summary, Your Holiness, those who are ill usually feel that's essential that they are not only cared for, but cared about. Curing without being able to offer care can create suffering, not just for patients, but for clinicians as well. The practice of medicine is grounded in clinical competence. It is also deeply embedded in the experience of relationship and the cultivation and expression of compassion. The deficit of compassion is relevant to the clinical experience, and it affects clinicians' well-being, patient and family satisfaction, frequency of clinician errors, and the retention of clinicians in their vocation. Skillful training of clinicians in compassion is of increasing importance today, Your Holiness, given the impact of technological medicine, work overload, staff shortages and conflicts, and institutional demands on the clinical or the clinician experience. So we've explored today a way in to bring compassion into the medical setting. So completing this short presentation, words that I think you often say to yourself: for as long as space exists and as long as beings exist, may I too remain to dispel the suffering of this world. So thank you, Your Holiness.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful.
Thank you very much. And I think you touched upon unconscious control, unconscious nature of the humans, which are compassionate, and it is trainable. It's brought up an explicit level. I think if it's the implicit level is good in nature or bad in nature, you need the training because it's good to explicitize, or it's bad because you need the training because it's bad. This is a deep debate of the Eastern philosophy for thousands of years. And I think you've touched upon the very deep levels of the human mind in itself, as the nature it is. And probably the next speaker will bring up how this implicit level of our consciousness or unconsciousness is structured. And he is going to make it a real hardcore science to explicitize that implicit nature of human consciousness. And this argument will be brought up by Shinsuke Shimojo, who is a professor of experimental psychology at California Institute of Technology, and he's also the visiting professor at the Kokoro Research Institute. So, Shin, are you ready for your talk?
Thank you so much.
So please.
So, Your Holiness, it is my greatest pleasure to meet you. And I'm very, very excited and feel very happy to have this opportunity with you. Of course, I would like to thank all the organizers and everybody sitting here to give me this opportunity. So this is my title, Implicit Mind and Sympathy. But I would like to directly jump into this illustration. And this is sort of like my icon summary of the entire talk. Your Holiness, as you may know, or you may have heard already, explicit conscious mind is only a tip of iceberg. Okay, it's a very small tip of iceberg. Why? In the brain, if you think about it, there are 100 to 200 billion neurons, and each one of them has 1 to 10,000 synapses, the synaptic connections. And if you calculate, if you think about the speed of information processing, then you know how much the brain can compute in terms of information amount. And if you think about how much you can consciously access in a second, okay, then you know that this illustration is already biased in the wrong direction, meaning that I have to actually increase the level of water to even higher, and maybe just single point is in your consciousness. Okay, so why is this relevant to me? Because I've been in implicit mental process, but towards the end, Your Holiness. Of course, I will show you some scientific evidence for this, but towards the end of my talk, Your Holiness, I would like to raise a question as to so-called first-person observation of the mind. That's been, to my shallow understanding, the regular practice in Buddhism training, and introspection in psychology terminology, versus this vast majority of brain which is in the implicit domain and which can only be accessed by objective scientific method. Now, how are they related is my ultimate question. Okay. So as for a very quick background, cognitive science, neuroscience have difficulty with certain issues, real-world issues, political, economic, cultural, etc., which are becoming serious in the modern world. And I believe there's a reason. And the reason is hard to describe, but I would use some terms such as complex causality, nonlinear dynamic interactions. This might sound weird, but basically it's too complicated and dynamic to predict. Okay? And context dependency. Now, what do I mean by context dependency? I would like to show an example in the next slide. So it's called oxytocin. You may have heard of this, perhaps. A mammalian neuropeptide acting sometimes as a hormone, acting sometimes as a neurotransmitter. It's been involved in sexual orgasm, pairing and maternal bonding, child rearing, social recognition, and anxiety reduction. So some people call this, quote, love hormone, unquote. Okay? And some people even argue that this organic chemistry approach can resolve all those serious real problems. Now, of course, as you can tell, in this audience, for sure, it turned out to be way too simplistic. Why? Because, in fact, I don't work on this, but I did review papers, and I realized that the triggered behavior depends very much on what species of animal you're talking about. A social type of animals or non-social type of animals, and also the context, the environment. Oxytocin promotes so-called ethnocentric behavior. Ethnocentric behavior. This is the consensus. So basically I'm saying that it's not that simple. And by ethnocentric I mean oxytocin sometimes increases more empathy, more friendly behavior within the group, but sometimes indifference, suspicion, rejection, and sometimes even aggressive action to outsiders. Okay? So at least in principle, oxytocin can increase love, but at the same time, it can promote a war. Okay? So this is what I mean by context dependency. So as for the guideline principles, I would like to say neural processing is largely implicit or subconscious. And implicit processes drive the explicit or conscious content of mind. They can operate independently of conscious process, such as logical thinking, but this is a key point. It is the implicit mind is highly susceptible to context. Why? It's because a lot of stimulus from environment. I would like to emphasize that implicit mind is highly susceptible to context because stimuli from the environment directly trigger response at the implicit level of the mind. Okay, there are lots of evidence: emotional response, motor response, a lot of responses. As the final point, I will also show some empirical evidence to say that people are connected at the implicit level. So implicit mind are characterized by two factors, two aspects. One is that it's very, very somatic, as I will tell you a little bit more. And second, it's social in a sense.
That's right.
Just come back to this iceberg again. This is my favorite picture. Let's apply this to memory as an example. Perhaps everybody understand, that explicit memory means you can recall. Implicit memory means you cannot recall consciously, but if tested, your behavior indicates that it's you remember. So, for example, if you deny that you cannot do bike riding, I can test you with putting you, by putting you on the bike ride in the slope, and then it turned out that you can bike ride, then implicit memory still restores this skill. Now, recognition is an interesting case because if I ask you or any of you to name your closest friend in the class in the elementary school, sometimes you cannot retrieve from your memory. But if somebody pointed out this should be this person, the name, then that's the one that was tip of the tongue. So that's recognition. So recognition is interesting because it's sitting somewhere between explicit mind and implicit mind, and this is a great example to indicate that the threshold between explicit and implicit mind fluctuates sometimes. There is a gray zone. Okay, and this is just an example. It is not limited to memory, perception, as Jay talked yesterday, and decision-making, emotion, many things, there's a similar structure. So implicit brain processing leads to conscious experiences. This is the general principle. I'm not the only person believing in my field. Okay, just to make sure.
So in this, can we go back to your
sure.
slide? So now in this model, you have sometimes situations where you recognize someone but don't remember the name.
Correct.
Where would that fit in this
so that's sitting here, exactly this recognition. So it's somewhere bit. So in fact, in the literature, some papers treated recognition as indicator of explicit memory, but some other papers using it as implicit indicator of memory. It's interesting because you cannot recall. That's one sign that it's not explicit memory in the strict sense. But when I show this, which one do you think is your classmate's name? Then you can correctly answer. So there's memory hidden in your brain. So it's explicit and implicit at the same time. No?
That's right.
Okay, so I just would like to bring in one.
Because this is one problem for me. I can easily recognize this person. But name, difficult to remember. So therefore, you see, sometimes, particularly here in Japan, you see, they fond you see, because of gift.
Yeah,
I think that's
business card, name card.
that's one of the many common symptoms.
Then I felt no use. I will not remember their name, but their face I remember.
We call it professor syndrome as well.
And then the Professor Mangelia, the
Same problem.
Professor Nazas Lagoris.
I see.
Okay, so anyway, I would like to bring in one finding from my own lab. It's called gaze cascade phenomenon, and this shows that your preference decision, which you like, it's most humanistic, lots of freedom type of decision, even that is preceded by implicit and somatic system, somatic process. So imagine that you are facing two objects, okay? Can be faces, can be objects, can be anything. And you are allowed to freely observe. And when you are consciously aware which one you like, you press the button to indicate immediately. It turned out, as this is a movie by the way, it turned out that your eyes are, of course, at the beginning equally comparing. So gaze distributed between two alternatives, but towards the end it's getting biased to one side, and then when it's really going like likelihood 80% or beyond, then for some reason everybody press the buttons and then saying, somehow I know now that I like this one better. So that's the first finding. So the point is that body chooses before the conscious mind chooses.
Dini the deje ne kan parni te kira pazu ni ga damje dinal ka gi double gaudo ani de lamsa munje chetu sunan dinnem slam gores de mi ta pazu ta urwa mi pazu ta dugalia kanda ji gaza kurang ge shebolung도 마 유고네 담까지 제
shebolung도 규하러 미시봉을 규하러
말다 kanda di kurang ge di nga dinga yo badi
다디 일루간 좀
데 일루간 나오 다디 뭔도 마 유고네 담과 제 사회 소리지 때 남주 tengu도 미 따당 거네
되게 버지 버리셨네.
So in the very special conditions, which I don't want to get into details, we have 7 seconds time window in which eyes are already biased, but you are not consciously aware which one you like. And it turned out that it's a very positive dynamic feedback because you look at it, then there's a perceptual processing deeper, and then there's facilitation to that object. That guides your gaze even further to that object. And then you get even more processing. So there's this positive loop, going and going, and that's the implicit process leading to the conscious decision. So this really reminded me of actually your lecture yesterday, intro lecture, where you have a cycle that seems to be very similar to at least one part of Buddhism tradition, I thought. So dynamic positive loop is important for liking. Now, in terms of science, we have to prove further. If we want to claim that gaze cascade is an inevitable somatic implicit precursor of conscious preference decision, then we should be able to manipulate people's preference by manipulating their gaze. There might be a little bit of ethical problem here, but we did that and we are successful in the laboratory. But even when the subjects are chosen more gazed face by our manipulation, they denied the causality. They denied that they gave up the freedom by manipulation. They start finding some reasons, like these faces have long hair and I like long hair, something like that. So it's very interesting.
가사 코로나 longo도 뭐 규에 레벨 차와 체제 남시지리아 뭐 육셰바 기기도 슬거와 대대지 두걸 다는 베는디 빠르니 나는 수수 가리에 되바체도 담쇼스 랍디고라 가사 코로나 담바디 마신콘 어디 가도 삼삼지 롤 마제 콘리아 미기 따당 돈에 담고 여버지 롭스 고치고 요레스 대대지 두걸 다 군주 미디 따당들이 군주 교와 당제 에는 디토는 담걸이야 교원 누구도 했다 두걸 담걸 교원 누구 요레스 Rete casa Koran ke tu kala ti game te mangata wa kyun jeng ti che mes chen la kutus.
Okay. So, people don't know why they choose that one. They post-deductive way, so sort of retrospective way, construct the causal reason. Now, this is interesting as an experiment, but is this anything to do with real world? So, I would like to introduce this interesting case of a flea who gave up jumping. I wonder, Your Holiness ever heard of this, but if you put that flea with small glass cup, then of course he or she jumps, each time punished by the glass, hit hard. Eventually, the poor animal gave up entirely and never jumped, even when the experimenter removed the glass, still staying there. Okay? Now, there's some evidence scientifically to show that even insects' innate reflexes can be eliminated entirely by training, by conditioning. So this is scientifically probably true. And in fact, in developmental psychology, educational psychology, clinical psychology, there's this term called learned helplessness. And this is exactly the case. What is very fortunate to observe in these days in modern Japan is that there's an increasing incidence of light degree of depression, mostly in young generations, and it's probably characterized as learned helplessness. And in 2010, the government calculated the financial loss by this depression, and it's minus $25 billion US. Money doesn't matter. This reduces people's happiness.
Can you explain learned
helplessness
in this context?
You try, failed. You try again, failed. You try again and again, all failed. You kind of learned that your trial is meaningless. No reward is given. So that's learned helpless status. So I just try to say our study is interesting in terms of, for instance, think about philosophical question of freedom, but it has some relationship to the real world. For instance, you can think this way. What is the happy state and what is the depressive, unhappy state? One can argue from our finding that the difference between healthy, happy, and sick or not happy should not be considered as that of mental state, static states, but rather a dynamic loops, but positive loop versus negative loop. So in this case, this is the healthy condition. You explore every day, finding something small, slightly interesting, that's giving you a reward in the brain, and then it gives you more motivation to explore. And another thing, and another thing I would like to add is that this loop includes not only the body but also the social environment. Because people cheer up. Why don't we run in the morning under the sunlight? That kind of things can really jump from this left side to the right side. Okay. As for the social environment aspect, I would like to bring in another experiment from my own lab, and it's implicating that people are connected at the implicit mind level. And Kokori-san experiment is our nickname for this experiment. Kokori-san, as some of you may know, it's a sort of half-joke parapsychological gameplay to read out group implicit mind. But in our particular case, two participants are pointing to each other like this. And the instruction is to neglect the other finger, just try to be as stationary as possible. Both sides. But our own 3D microscopic finger movement measurement indicates that even if both sides are trying not to move, their fingers are synchronized in the microscopic level. Okay, from the beginning. But another thing we found is that after some social interaction, in our case, it's called cooperative training, because in this training, one is moving fingers randomly, and the other has to follow. Okay? The leader leading guys also need to read the other mind so that it's easy to follow. So it's like an orchestration of behavior. Then do this task again. Neglect again. Just stay there. Believe it or not, this implicit finger synchrony is increased. But only after cooperative training, but not in non-cooperative training or anything else. Do you think he has why do we are we interested in this, and why do we think this is the biological basis of being social? Just think about fireflies, as I listed here. Fireflies starts lighting on and off across individuals. It's all out phase, no relationship at the beginning. But if you stare at them a little while, it's getting synchronized, on and off together. If you the same applies to frog singing, bird singing, and even human gating, because if a couple are walking together in a very good, lovely relationship, their gait tends to be synchronized. There are evidence for this. So we thought, this is interesting. We can use this as a tool to increase cooperativity, and what kind of activity increases the cooperativity is an interesting question. But what happens between the two brains? That is the question that we wanted to really address. So I just wanted to show this one technical slide. This is the leader's brain. Just in the training, leaders. Yeah. This is the follower's brain, but the neural data are in this test, not move at all, after this cooperative training. Now these lines before the cooperative training, there is no relationship between two brain wave sets, one from one brain, the other from the other brain. But after this cooperative interaction, I think it can be just chatting, it can be singing together. Then later on, these lines indicate that particular part of the brain of the leader is synchronized in brainwave with the follower's brain, but slightly different functional parts.
So this is when they are doing the task of...
No, this is during the task of not moving at all.
Yeah, so this is functional, at the time. At the time while they are not moving their fingers.
Right, they are doing this not moving task. So just to summarize, fingers became synchronized implicitly, and it's increased by cooperation, as I repeatedly mentioned. But the brain regions known for empathy, sympathy, or making a guess or perceiving how the other mind is feeling, those brain areas were connected interpersonally by such cooperative interaction, but not before interaction, or when they are fighting, then they don't increase. It turned out that it's not decreasing either for some reason, but there's no connection between the brain in those cases. Okay? Now, of course, people would argue, in fact, I'm always criticized by social psychologists saying, well, you are not doing anything about social.
Brain region is not for theory of mind, sympathy.
Correlated with socially. Tamed. Gavuyana.
Gavuyana ya tu de lebanyi namju de tumbache. Ya gavumena shanan dan jingnan de.
저 사람들이 제도가.
So wouldn't that be seen as a sort of an effect from the conscious to the unconscious processes? Because if they like each other, or if there is a fear element in the relationship, that affects the synchrony.
That's a very sharp observation, because during the cooperation, of course, both are aware about what they are doing. And that may be, although we don't have data, but that may likely be the important condition for the later test. The later test itself, however, I would call implicit. Because they're trying not to move. The brain not to synchronize, but synchronize. So I entirely agree. So the explicit interpersonal relationship leads to implicit interpersonal synchrony. Okay, so I'm done. Just the implications. As you can see, there are lots of real-world implications, I believe, but I would like to focus on rather philosophical implications. And the point number one, there's this thing called mind-body dichotomy in the Western philosophy, especially after Descartes. Now, to me, it's already a nonsense facing my own data, because it seems to be artificially exaggerated. I showed you this iceberg icon many times, and there's this water level, and explicit and implicit minds were diverged between them. But both of my data, I believe, indicating that explicit mind is interacting vigorously with implicit mind, and the border is actually fluctuating. Now, meditation changes this borderline. It's an interesting question, I think. But either way, it's very much coupled. Now, if you look at the gaze data and the finger data, you should agree with me that when I talk about implicit mind, it's very much to do with somatic process, physiological process, biomechanical processes. So, implicit mind and body are actually not dissociable. If explicit mind and implicit mind are very, very connected, and implicit mind and body are very, very connected, then what is the point about mind-body dichotomy and exaggerating it? So that's my feeling. The second point, and this is probably hard to explain, but there's this thing called dualism difficulty in my mind, and I have to explain perhaps dualism first, but dualism usually says on top of the physical world existence, there's this existence of mental world of its own right, and it's independent of the physical world. Now, typically, the dualists say further and say you shouldn't eliminate the possibility that the mental event can cause the physical results. And indeed, honestly, your Holiness, I found a similar sentence in your book. You said you should not eliminate the possibility, and eliminating it is typical in neuroscientists, but it's a dogmatic prejudice. Um, 99.9% of neuroscientists would say dualism is nonsense. I'm not. Why? Because I do believe that if you accept this thing, a little bit hard to say, but intersubjectivity or the psychological reality shared among people, then that causes physical events all the time in our daily life. Look at the stock market. Okay, look at the public opinion influences things in the world. That's shared psychological reality. It's certainly not materialistic reality, but that psychological, once shared, going beyond single brain, influences physical world and social structure and stuff like that. So, when a brain is considered in a social context, this B, the possibility, should not be eliminated. So due to the time limit, I think I skip this, but there's plenty of evidence in developmental psychology, acquiring of language, entrainment, and genesis of consciousness, etc. So basically, I'm done. But looking at the current modern Japan, we have lots of problems, and I especially draw your attention to the Fukushima 311, and what's happening right now there in Tohoku is an annoying problem with who is your friend and who is not. For instance, there's a conflict between the power-producing prefectures and power-consuming prefectures. They don't share psychological reality. They are not in group in terms of oxytocin effect. And there's a more microscopic discrimination across borders due to the political arbitrary selection, because with certain distance from the nuclear plant, you get financial compensation. Even if 1 meter outside of that borderline, you don't. And they suddenly, friends becoming, neighborhood friends suddenly becoming enemies. Okay? So facing these situations.
Power plant tarang tung ke shi ge sarwa de de chen du gal che ta ta shu du gal ka shi meter ka shi jing chilo yu ne konzo ngu ma ra nya na de to ka.
So facing all those rather sour environment, I think I provided rather good news from neuroscience, saying we are more connected than thought before. And whenever I say this, what's in my mind is this kind of picture, which is basically lotus flowers. It's again something to do with Buddhism culture, I guess. But what I mean is this: each flower is the individual. Some is prosperous, some is big, some is small, some is getting old and getting died. But deep under the water, they are connected by roots. And roots, in my case, is the body and social implicit mind. Okay, so I'm done with just one question to you. Just one more question, and I sort of said this at the beginning. So, as I said at the beginning, only very, very small portion of the mind is consciously accessible. Now, because of this, and also that this orange part, implicit mind can be accessed only by objective method, such as behavioral neural. Psychology and neuroscience abandoned introspection many, many years ago. Now, how is this reconcilable with long-lasting Buddhism tradition of first-person experience is my question. And one thing I want to say is that modern science is aware of this. And for instance, perception study with fMRI. This is a first-person mental experience studied with neuroscientific tool. So it's not true that science is third person. Buddhism is first person, but I do think there's a little bit of this divergence there. So I would like to hear Your Holiness word on this.
There is a two condition than the that Kurang Shimju than the Chebe can do Goliatic. Shebe Rimabu, Chikadam, Mundu Cube, the Chashi, the Yuj Mamache, the Mambuchi Lebe Chashi, Mambush, which the Mundu Kasa Kurang Mudu Majube, Chachi de Goro, Jobush, which happened to go to the Degatone. This is to go that. 온도 많이 가사 그러는 온도 많이 규배게 내가 되게 참아 근데 치료는 다제제제 레벨 남주다 neuroscience and measurement and 되게 돈 다제제 뭐도 가사 그런 걸 높여주지 시신때 아니 간다 로랑 게 돈에 롤다야 돼 용도고 말아서 낭배의 숙체 first person 기 대답시 윤두가 다 들려야 아니 다 답시로 가려요 나스
First, I want to ask one question. As yesterday I mentioned, some of my friends actually have the ability to concentrate. What's that?
Single-pointedly.
A single-pointed sort of object. Sometimes look at mind itself. So, without any distraction. Distraction. Can remain 3 hours, 4 hours.
So, given that, as a neuroscientist, from the neuroscience point of view, is that something that the human beings are capable of? being able to stay focused without distraction for such a length of time?
Science, in a lot of cases, are post-addictive, in my opinion. And we face the phenomenon and try to explain. So now that you told me that good Buddhist meditation practitioners can do this, I think science can approach to that phenomenon, can figure out something about the brain, just as Rich has done.
Yeah. That's very good. Genuine scientist. Genuine scientist. Open. That's good.
기고에 저도 나베게 셰베 돌다제 제가 답시 숙체에 간다지 곰게 돈이 내도 로장제 아니 로로 따이제 셰베 따지 지고를 봤어. 되는 다 군주심 주제도 베톤에 레베 남샤 망부슈 레베
앞에는 솔롱 고미야지. 가서 셰베도 드라용 거 봐.
그래. 대단 코란스나 디 레베 자와 망부슈지 가서 코란 것도 막 유베게 자시 숙심부슈 되가라. 텔레야 로로 따위네. 비게 네버
당연한데 environment chigo gesha is something more. In modern big city, one individual, you see, can meditate. The environment same, but through training of mind, you see, without any disturbances. Environment chigo.
So, although we are susceptible to environment, but one can also override it. So there could be individuals who are not, who can consciously take a stand and develop this kind of, quiet mind, even in a busy city.
I think understand this name society.
So of course, much of our discussion is really staying at the level of general public, the experience of the common person.
That's very true. The social environment
makes a big difference.
And also climate. And all these make differences. I think I would like to have some sort of research work in northern world, northern Europe. During winter, 24 hours remain dark. At least I think 2-3 months, I think, completely dark. So some sort of test. So during summer, the midnight sun. So what differences in their mental sort of the brain activities?
There are some professional baseball players who do well in the sunny day. And he is not, of course, aware of it, but statistically it's true.
So how much sort of effect because of the brain level, the climate and dark and light. Bright light. Sometimes I describe myself as a Dalai Lama of sleep. Sleep Dalai Lama. Sleeping Dalai Lama. Sleep. So I prefer, because of the long night, better. Sometimes in Norway or Mongolia also, about 3 morning, already some sign, because of the sun coming. Late.
Daylight.
9, 10, still light there. Uncomfortable. I prefer, because of that, long night is much better. So in any way, it's more serious. You see, sometimes.
His Holiness is more on a more serious note. He's interested in finding out to what extent the environment really has this huge impact on our mental experience.
Yes, I think it's both serious and non-serious comments are wonderful. And as for your serious comment, note that my data are not including those trained meditators.
Yes, that's right.
These are just ordinary people. I think it's an intriguing question as to how much you can acquire by training in terms of bending the threshold of implicit and explicit mind and peep into the implicit mind by top-down attentional control and focus.
Obviously, of course, through training, you see, you can increase because of the peace of mind. As a result, the 24 hours, your mental state completely relaxed. Does not change through physical level, but through difference, through training or through change at mental level. That's obvious. Of course, I have not much sort of the deeper sort of the high sort of the experiences, but some experiences. Now today is my mental state. Compare, I think, 20, 30 years ago. This is some differences.
Of course.
Maybe age also is some factor, but mainly through training.
Yeah.
Each day, about, as I mentioned yesterday, at least 4 hours, some thinking. And then, when you pass, then I think the compassion. Compassion, you see, must combine with wisdom. I think without wisdom, without intelligence, analytical sort of because of the thinking, then our compassion is biased, limited, and weak. Ordinary compassion is not universal compassion. Universal, that kind of compassion, even animal also have.
The capacity.
I think because flea, I don't know. Whether they have the ability to show affection to their companion. When they are made decision, maybe a little bit. Otherwise, I don't know. Generally, even animal, those, you see, their youngsters' survival depend on others' care. Then biologically, you see, emotionally, then, you see, affection come. That is biological factor, not training. So we also, firstly, social animal, secondly, come from our mother. So we also, everybody have used that
capacity.
That capacity. Then you human being use human intelligence, pros and cons, right? Anger, selfish, what benefit? And again, this self,
so
self.
Professor Kitayama, you talked about self and others. Yeah.
I think in a deeper way, the very reason why you take care of others also is yourself, related with self-interest. So my interest for my own sort of peace of mind or healthy body, very much related with more open, more friendly attitude to others. So we are social animals. Whether we like it or not, we have to live among the humanity. There's no other choice. Now today, we have to live among the 7 billion human beings, one world, or not like ancient Japan, ancient You just self-sufficient, your rice and your fish. Okay. Now modern time, your economy depends on the rest of the other world. We depend also. In the past, we simply sit there and sometimes maybe meditate. That, I think, really brought a disaster. Because we are part of the world. So we have to sort of look global level. The Japanese future also is depend on because of the global level, global humanity. I think each nation, no matter how powerful, is ultimately they are part of the world. So we have to think. So use these because of the reasons. Animal cannot do. We use this, and then we can develop genuine sense of concern of others' well-being. Because others, we are part of the society. Society happy, I will happy. So again, the altruistic mind ultimately related with because of the cherishing self. But because of the, from the Buddhist viewpoint, the Buddhahood
So even in the Buddhist practice, the aspiration for Buddhahood it has both dimensions of self-interest and others' interest.
Oh, like that. So compassion together, the self just said, "Pay your charity."
Yes.
Rob's shaving, chingmas self, and because the selflessness is a social mass.
So sometimes people tend to misunderstand compassion as suggesting totally disregarding one's own welfare.
That's right.
So that's not the case.
The empathy, compassion, still I don't know. What is the real meaning of the English word? I don't know.
Word empathy.
So sometimes I'm confused. I don't know.
So, Your Holiness, it's actually pretty simple. Empathy has been often conflated in the literature with compassion. But for the purposes of training clinicians, I untangle them because empathy I describe, and in certain literature is described as affective resonance. In other words, it's a feeling into the other person's experience at the affective level. Whereas compassion includes empathy, but you can become overwhelmed. So Tanya Singer uses the term empathic over-arousal or empathic distress. So when empathy is unregulated, then distress happens.
So
only subset any usually that usually go show tungele ta tungede merajana sabasang ninji tungede seya yebaji tongni ta tungede trende ninji doa.
So even so even at the ordinary level, when we look at compassion, moving from empathy onwards to compassion, one can also see different degrees. There could be a simpler form of compassion where your compassion is only in the form of wanting, wishing the other person to be well. But then there could be a more active form of compassion where you recognize that you can do something about it.
So actually, second level, you should have this sort of understanding. There is possibility to overcome that.
To do something about it, yeah.
Then you see some kind of stronger sense of sort of concern about their well-being, seeing some sort of possibility. Then action. That should really
it comes more forcefully, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So
wisdom.
So here the wisdom,
intelligence,
insight. What I've done is characterize it as insight.
Insight, yeah.
Yeah, but concern is not enough.
And then I think for Buddhist practitioner, in
the context of Buddhist practice, then of course, taking into account the three levels of suffering,
Right.
that description becomes important.
동해지동에, 교회동에, 누지동에.
So you have the evident suffering, and then the suffering of change, and the suffering of conditioned existence.
And life after life. That is the
And then you bring in
concept of
the concept of life after life.
Only this life. And it 동해지동에 짱짱 삼단데 전에 즉 가서 overwhelming 아주 속차요.
Because if within the framework where you understand suffering only in the context of the evident acute suffering,
right.
And then also if the framework is only this life, then sometimes
only one life.
The perception of suffering can be overwhelming.
그 삼로 자체를 동네 숨을 때.
So whereas if you opened up the understanding of suffering on the three levels, then it sort of opens it up.
Gives it a big horizon.
Bigger horizon.
Wonderful.
So that also prevents a feeling of being overwhelmed.
Yeah, having that big horizon or that perspective of so-called many lifetimes.
But in ordinary level also, I think when someone, some cases, some people approach to me and complain a lot of sort of sufferings or things. Then, because of that's also part of our practice. Firstly, you see, you should share your own problem with that person. Then that, you see, makes the person, not only myself, even Dalai Lama also a lot of suffering. However, you see, I'm thinking this is try to keep optimism, and share with this. So, in spite of this difficult problem, that difficult sort of experience and situation, you should not lose your sort of the self-confidence. There's always possibility to overcome. So, think just oneself and then overwhelm. Think more. Then,
so then there's immediate change, shift. I think we need to...
So the
question for the neuroscientist is did the change occur in brain first and then was experienced, or was the change in the experience in mental level first and then it changed the brain?
I think it's a chain. Brain first, then there's a mental cause, and the mental cause is brain cause. It's chain, go back to...
Like this discussion goes over and over again, and so probably I think we are running short of this time of this extensive morning.
Thank you, Your Holiness.
Thank you very much for wrapping up this complex mode of self, and thank you very much for your guidance and appreciation.
Wonderful.